The Innkeeper by Life Sketcher. Chapter 1671, Full Force. An ominous mood filled the castle as they all looked out at the enemies in front of them, the mercenaries ready to stake everything to ensure that they survive the upcoming fight. Lex, meanwhile, looked at the mercenaries oddly. "Guys, in case it wasn't abundantly clear already, you really don't need to worry that a mere 100 chimeras are going to take us down," said Lex as he looked down at them. "Like honestly, they're a little troublesome, I'll admit, and if we don't close the portals, we could be in a little trouble but, well, you've seen the many various members of the Inn fight independently, but have you ever seen us all fight together? Now I'm not saying that we're underestimating Abaddon or something, but this is still not a threat that can break our walls." They all looked up at Lex skeptically. Their experience in Abaddon told them that the moment they began to see hope would be crushed. The midnight and bringing its tavern to them had been a pleasure that they could not even begin to explain, and even more than they wanted to finish their mission, they wanted to ensure that nothing would happen to the tavern or its staff. Lex was about to placate them a little, but a deep drum beat interrupted him, its sound traveling from the core of the castle to the surrounding glaciers, crushing countless wraiths. "You all don't understand," said Z, who was standing atop the ramparts. Of course, he couldn't expressly say that all of this was probably expressly curated by Lex to serve as the next step in his training montage. Instead, he said something that sounded a little nicer. "Not even armies of vile monstrosities can prevent the Midnight Inn from providing top-notch service to its guests." Lex wanted to wipe a tear from his eyes. How the kids grow up so fast. Of course, he didn't actually cry. Instead, he simply smirked, and once again renewed his focus on figuring out how to use the new characters he had just learned. In the meantime, the Midnight Workers unleashed a fury that even they had never fathomed. So far, they had been holding back, using the most efficient ways to fight, or training a few members who needed to try out their new powers. They had never tried unleashing all their powers together, so even they didn't know how strong they were. Of course, they couldn't blindly let their powers loose, that would only cause chaos, and reduce the effectiveness of their attacks. Instead, Leonidas, who had literally been training all his life, took over command of the fight from both Z and Luther, directing all the forces of the Midnight Inn. Amidst the sound of war drums initiated by Z, Little Blue and Sunny took to the air to regain aerial supremacy. Fenrir, with his stealth, carried Luther behind enemy lines, all the while casually killing wraiths as he passed. The Midnight Battalion, along with the 500 mortal workers, formed the Midnight Mech, activating the various features granted to the battalion via the battalion panel that Lex had. The walls of the castle itself began to shine, giving off a faint aura similar to dragon's might. The castle, made entirely out of dragon scales, had begun to develop a unique aura of its own, created through the history that the castle had experienced. It also helped that many of the insects from within the jungle had worked tirelessly to improve the castle. So while the castle was not sentient, or even a living thing, it did provide enough defense and deterrence. Suddenly, the invading army that initially seemed so daunting didn't look so scary anymore. Somewhere far in the back, Luther had unleashed his newfound hellfire, creating a secondary circle of fire around the castle. It wasn't meant as a form of defense, though it worked that way. Instead, it was meant to trap the chimera inside. Z stood atop the castle wall, and instead of lunging into battle, used his baton and controlled the war music that elevated all the Inn staff and attacked all their enemies. Lex, floating above the castle, only smirked. Yes, a few chimeras were far from being the most of what they could handle. Heck, Lex hadn't even used his Lotus powers recently, despite the fact that Lotus had been strengthened so much from his newly acquired paladin powers. Yes, things were well in control so far. Hopefully, it stayed that way. Lex closed his eyes and began to meditate on the characters, refreshing his understanding of them entirely. The mercenaries, who had all gathered in the castle grounds to fight the invading army even until death, watched in stunned silence as the Inn members wreaked havoc. Sometimes, it was tough to remember that they were the warriors, and the members of the Midnight Inn were merely workers at a tavern. This was one such time. Little Blue, still groggy from overeating, dared not try to eat again. Instead, he spread his wings and declared his dominance in the sky by cutting through all adversaries with his wings. Sunny, too, didn't forget to shoot a few flares here and there, burning enemies that came too close. Mostly it was just slacking off. With Little Blue there was little that Sunny could do. While everyone else was stunned, Cayman continued to watch seriously. As the leader of the Reaving Dread, when he said the Chimera were formidable enemies, he was not exaggerating. He knew that they wouldn't be so easily defeated, and true to his expectations, while all other enemies fell, the Chimeras endured. They were beaten. They were pushed back. But above all else, they endured, and they adapted. At first, it was not too obvious, but as the minutes turned to hours, and then days, the changes started becoming more and more prominent. The Instaff displayed amazing stamina, fighting continuously for so long, but the Chimera were never weakened, and had only gotten stronger. Lex, if things don't change, the situation is going to drastically get worse, Cayman warned as he himself considered some drastic options. Chapter 1672, Flow. Lex frowned. Life was truly difficult when determining one's strength was not so straightforward. Everyone present on the battlefield was an Earth immortal, more or less. Yet, when compared to an average Earth immortal, any one of them would be far superior. Thus, in a way, they had already surpassed the threshold of power normally associated with Earth immortals. Now the problem was that he was facing successive enemies, each one with a power level surpassing the norms of their cultivation level, with each set of enemies being even stronger than the previous one. Was there an upper ceiling for the amount of power one could achieve within a certain realm? Probably. But determining the median power level, as well as the general upper ceiling in terms of power cultivation level could have, was not something Lex was interested in. Instead, it would be great if he could figure out why the Chimera were so strong, and what could be done about it. Tell everyone to change tactics. Instead of trying to kill the Chimera, just block and hold them off. Once I manage to block off the portals, I can look into why they're so hard to kill. At a glance, Lex could tell that it wasn't impossible to kill the Chimera, not only for him, but for others as well. Heck, even Cayman could do it. The problem was that the price to kill even one Chimera was too great, and would likely mean that the warrior would be bedridden for days or weeks. The cost-to-benefit ratio was completely askew. Even though the Chimera were learning and evolving, the battle was very much under control. Most of the Griffin were already dead, and the Wraiths, despite their great numbers, posed only a limited amount of threat. Lex also didn't feel any significant problem from his barrier that was blocking the portals, so the chance of them breaking open wasn't high. Lex tried another array using those characters, only to fail again. Others had tried simpler methods of trying to close the portals, such as destroying them. The fact that Lex was still trying his array method was a clear testament to the outcome of those attempts. "Come now, Lex, why are you in such a rush to end this game?" 1,000 voices asked from the outside, not that anyone paid attention to it. Although it was highly disturbing that it was so focused on Lex, none were intimidated by it. In fact, as a result of this particular battle alone, the members of the Midnight Inn had accumulated a vast amount of positive karma themselves. They were all feeling pretty good about it, since the arrival of positive karma was something that could physically be felt once it was great enough. Lex was the only one concerned about such a good thing. There was definitely a concept of too much of a good thing that existed in this universe, and sometimes positive karma required sufficient strength to be able to receive the rewards that karma brings. Lex could see traces of a conspiracy being laid out in front of him, and he didn't like it. It had never talked before, but when it did, it directly said his name, and made clear that it had the ability to plot. As if that wasn't enough, lately, Lex had faced no obstacles from his opponent on the Go board. One by one, Lex seemed to be dominating the board, but the opponent never responded. He didn't believe that his victory would come so easily, so he was especially wary of any trouble coming his way. He needed to resolve the situation before things become too dangerous. Unfortunately, he didn't really have a way to force himself into enlightenment in things where his comprehension was lacking. He couldn't just magically understand things he didn't understand. Or so he thought. His instincts suddenly guided him, hinting towards a certain video he hadn't bothered to see. The timing of that instinctual feeling was odd, so through his clone, Lex entered into a meditative state as he connected with the system and reviewed the recording of William Safori's, his ancestors, fight in the death match. To an extent, Lex already knew what happened in the fight, which was the reason he couldn't be bothered to look at the actual fight. He was busy with other stuff. The moment he did, however, Lex was stunned. Was that his flow state? Was his state of flow something he inherited from his ancestor? A bloodline? More importantly, how had his ancestor, who seemed so mediocre compared to everything else Lex had seen, been able to produce such an insane technique? It seemed that he needed to pay more attention to his family. There were more secrets there than he had anticipated. With his main body, Lex entered the state of flow. This state, for a very long time, had barely been helpful to him. He used it on and off, but for the most part it was merely a minor addition to his own abilities. After all, he could effortlessly control his thoughts and actions without needing to use the flow state. The flow state, according to what Lex used to think, simply allowed him to be as efficient and effective in his decisions and actions as possible. In a way, once he became an immortal, his normal state was akin to the flow state since his mental capacity had increased so much. Now, though, Lex knew that the ability was so much greater. It was not just his own thoughts and actions that entered the perfect flow, but his application of laws, and everything exterior to his body as well. He had not advanced his flow state in a long time, so it wasn't exactly easy to suddenly progress. That said, now that he had seen how William did it, Lex simply needed to learn from him. Since the ability was one that was literally ingrained into his blood, learning it took merely a few minutes. Then, Lex began to feel the flow of energies all around him with greater sensitivity than he had ever before. He started to sense how the laws around him fluctuated. Chapter 1673, A Change. Family was a complicated topic for Lex. His parents were jerks, his grandfather was worse than a pig, and though his ancestors hadn't done anything to provoke him, he just had developed a general distrust of his own family. That said, he had a decent relationship with his sisters, mainly because they were just as much victims of his terrible family as him, if not even more in Moon's case. He'd also learned that his family had some apparently mysterious background and that if anyone in other realms detected that he was descendant of the Sephor bloodline, he could attract trouble. Lex didn't pay too much attention to that, though. He had no problem attracting trouble without needing to rely on his ancestry to help him out. Even so, for the first time, his family had managed to attract his attention because this flow was by no means a normal technique. Even he, who had seen no shortage of incredible feats and techniques from talents across the universe, was impressed. As soon as he extended the flow state beyond his body, Lex had to divert a majority of his brain power on processing all the information he was getting. It was as if the state allowed him to read the flow of every form of existence he could naturally sense. So he could see how light was traveling. He could sense how sound carried across a baton. He could sense the countless forms of energy in the air, flowing with furious currents, waging an unseen, undetected war all around them. Through his tenet, he could even sense how the laws were changing from moment to moment. These were all things he could already sense, to a degree, but entering the flow state multiplied the extent manifold. Much more important than that, though, were the patterns Lex saw in everything. It was as if he could see the path of least resistance, but in everything. Since this was the first time he used the ability like this, and hadn't been looking for something specific, he was just overloaded with every single possibility around him. But, being in the flow state as he was, he adapted instantly and returned his attention to the portals. Whereas the ability of his left eye previously allowed him to gain a tremendous amount of information about whatever he looked at, including weaknesses he could exploit, the flow state just took that to a whole other level. It was as if, among the weaknesses he could detect, flow allowed him to be able to pick out what was the best one. In his flow state, as he looked at the portals, he detected that using the array was not actually the best way to get rid of the portals. In fact, his own mastery of space should have been the first thing he thought of using, and it should have been an obvious choice. But Lex hadn't even considered that, only thinking about the characters. He suddenly realized what Cayman meant when he said that the weight of knowledge was not so easy to endure, and that whether he wanted to or not, he kept thinking about the knowledge he had attained in those ruins. Even now, when Flo had shown him that simply using the laws of space it would be infinitely easier for him to destroy those portals than to try and use the characters, Lex did not want to just give up. Though, he attributed that to his stubbornness and not the weight of the knowledge itself. Since he had spent so long trying to use the characters, he wanted to try one more time. If it didn't work, he would give up for now since a better alternative was present. The moment he decided on the course of action he wanted to take, he could immediately see countless pieces of information that would help him. Since an array was something he would have to create, and not something that existed in his surroundings already, the flow state couldn't help guide him on how to use it. Nor could the flow state tell him which array to use, or how to make it. Instead, he just made him more aware of the things that were most relevant to what he wanted to do, picking out the minutest of details amidst a proverbial endless sea of information. Even Lex himself could not pinpoint relevant hints with such accuracy despite his many advantages. It was as if he was tapped into the universe itself, and was getting constant, live feedback. Oh, and he had a search bar to narrow down just what he wanted. Lex began the array once more, this time guided by the many hints the flow state was giving him. The state wasn't a complete cheat code, and Lex still had to decide on his course of actions as well as think of a new way to use the characters. But the flow state did eliminate a lot of unnecessary noise and help him focus a lot better. In fact, if Lex weren't in the flow state, he would probably be wondering what effects the other states he had would have outside his body. After all, besides flow, he also had overdrive and berserk states as well, both states he didn't use nearly as often as flow. In fact, considering how overdrive increased the computational power of his brain, as well as allow him to consider things he normally wouldn't have, it might have been the better option for what he needed right now. But since he was in his flow state, he wasn't thinking of any of that. He was simply taking the quickest, most efficient series of actions to complete his objective. A few seconds later, a new array was ready. The very moment he activated it, there was finally a change that could be felt in the very air around them. His characters, living up to the name of the book they had come from, finally brought about a change. Chapter 1674, Lex is 25 years old. By now, Lex had seen the characters at work over 100 times. They hardly ever worked with a bang. Instead, the array would dissipate into the environment, correcting the wrongness as it did. This time, however, the characters weren't correcting a wrongness. No, they were making a change forcibly, even if the method was designed to be as smooth as possible. As such, it was inevitable that as soon as the array started working, its effects would not be inconspicuous. Flashes of red and orange filled the sky, cutting through the darkness of the night. Various colors began melding into the black lightning bolt that was frozen still, not only disrupting its existence, but interfering with the portal hidden within it. The icy glacier beneath their feet, too, began to change. It remained solid, but instead of the hard and impenetrable, the ice became soft and wobbly. The ceiling of the cave entrance began to droop, pushing down some of the chimera at the mouth of the cave who were attacking Lex's barriers. Lex had anticipated that he would face great resistance to initiating a change, even possibly attracting the wrong kind of attention from Abaddon. Instead, it seemed that Abaddon found the state of change that Lex initiated perfectly normal. In a way, Lex really was correcting a wrongness, for Abaddon was a place of flux, and forcibly creating portals was temporarily ceasing that flux state. It seemed to have detected the change that Lex had initiated, but it did not seem too bothered by it. Instead, the countless bodies it possessed merely smiled in an even more horrifying way. Lex could not help but feel like it was studying him, and revealing more about himself seemed like a bad idea. Even so, it wasn't as if he could simply ignore an attack on the tavern either. It was an open conspiracy, and one he couldn't do much about at the moment. Lex, however, wasn't really one to allow an enemy to gain the upper hand. Since it preferred the route of an open conspiracy, he could take the route of a hidden one. After all, just as it was studying him, he was also studying it. Gradually, the two portals changed so much that they ceased to work, finally alleviating a huge burden that the entire mercenary group was under. But while the threat of more chimeras was gone, the existing ones were still a threat they hadn't dealt with. Lex thought of a few different solutions, but before committing to one, tried to use the state of flow to study the chimera. They truly presented themselves as an unstoppable force, with no apparent weakness for them to exploit. Even so, with the guidance of his instincts, he studied his surroundings before arriving at an answer that made perfect sense, but that he would not have thought of on his own without flow. Lex could not help but sigh as he exited his flow state. He wondered how much easier his life would have been if he'd been using his flow state properly from the start. Then again, he really couldn't be blamed. His strength was always growing so rapidly that he barely ever had time to fully familiarize himself with his strength. If he ever wrote an autobiography, it would have to be titled The Laments of a Genius Cultivator. How else could he explain his situation? This was the cultivation equivalent of a champagne problem. No, a very serious note, he really had grown in strength very quickly. After all, he was barely, 25? No, wait, he got his system at 25, and then he spent a couple of years at the inn, not to mention the time trapped in the crystal realm, and then there was the stuff after that, and then the years within the midnight realm while the inn was sealed, which was over a decade, and... Lex stopped counting. The way he saw it, he'd gotten a whole new body after the incident at the Temple of Fasting where he was turned into the patty for a smashburger, so that basically reset his age. There was no way he was going to accept that he was older than. Lex took a deep breath and pushed those thoughts away. Cultivators had long lives, and he was basically immortal, so in cultivator terms, calling himself a 25-year-old was actually raising his relative age. Yes, in the cultivator word, he could still be counted as a teenager, if not even younger. Yes, there was no way that he had entered, and then crossed, his 30s. No way, that was not possible. He was 25. He also didn't weigh a ton, those were blasphemous rumors spread about him on the Henali portal, and nothing more. So as a 25-year cultivator, he barely had any time to familiarize himself with all his strengths, so he graciously decided to forgive himself for not knowing about the flow state's full potential. With that done, he turned his attention to the one man who had the capability to single-handedly resolve their current chimera problem. Luther, you know the castle has a dungeon, right? Why don't you go ahead and capture the chimera and then we can treat them as prisoners in the dungeon? That way we can study what makes them so strong, and work out ways to fight against them. Not to mention, I think they'll make good fertilizer for the castle's personal greenhouse. Luther, who was outside the castle walls, fighting alongside Fenrir, trembled as he heard those words. A fire of passion, and definitely not a deep, malevolent hellfire, lit in his eyes, evaporating the ice all around him. Finally, he could get his hands on some prisoners. He'd given up hope about being able to capture the Dark Knight, but now he had something even better right in front of him. Killing them is too hard, but if it's just capturing them, you can leave it to me, Luther said as he patted his chest. I will reluctantly accept this mission. Nothing about his body language stated that he felt reluctant. Chapter 1675, Paranoia. If Lex was 25, then sometimes it felt like the in-workers were 15. Seen through that specific lens, Luther was a young teenager going through a dark and emo phase, who would get overly excited at the mere prospect of imprisoning and interrogating enemies. It brought an enthusiastic and genuine side of him, which was in complete contrast with the cool and level-headed guy he was trying to be. Perhaps only Lex, who had known Luther from the moment he was born, could see him as an awkward teenager. After all, he was a man with a genuinely frightening power, and a bloodline that boasted use of the power of time. Time was such a dangerous concept that even Lex never dared to experiment with it. A small mistake while dealing with karma caused Lex's body to blow up, but even the slightest of mistakes while tinkering with the laws of time would result in Lex ceasing to exist entirely. There was no recovery from that, regardless of how tough or durable his body was. So even though Luther's bloodline only affected himself, there was no room for doubt when considering how formidable he was. Even though he was free now, Lex simply watched Luther let loose, and did not fight himself at all. Since it was so interested in Lex, he would not make it any easier for it to gather information on him. As he watched the fight, and eventually witnessed Luther use his self-created ability, Chains of Oblivion, which were basically chains made of hellfire which trapped and tortured his targets, Lex began to wonder if it was truly so hard to make one's own lawcraft. He seemed to have no trouble doing it, and Luther had done it too, so why was Zeke complaining so much? From the corner of his eye, he glanced towards Z, but then turned his attention away. It was best not to pressure the little guy too much. Instead, he simply watched as the chimera, ignoring the searing torture of the chains, tried to break the chains. Remarkably, the chains did not break, though it was immediately obvious to Lex that this could not be a long-term solution. He would need to personally create barriers within the dungeons in the castle to trap the chimeras, and preferably even upgrade the entire dungeon itself. More importantly, before he did any of that, he would need to exorcise it from their bodies so that it would never know what he was capable of, or the interior of the castle, or how it worked. Lex turned away from the battle even as Luther yelled at the others to come and reinforce his chains. Z used seals, the battalion suppressed them with the power of the mech, Fenrir froze them and Little Blue spanked the chimeras with his wings. Remarkably, the chimeras were the only creatures he had encountered so far who could resist being completely sliced by his wings. But even then, it was only resistance, nothing more. The mercenaries, too, stepped up, unwilling to let this capture of chimeras turn into a fluke. They used everything available to them, from chains, handcuffs, spiritual techniques, sealing techniques, blankets, hemp rope, socks, all and more until, instead of 100 chimera, there was just a massive mound of cloth that was both simultaneously frozen and on fire in front of the castle. The sight was quite comical, if one ignored the fact that the mercenaries were still quite stressed. The chimera had been contained, but this was very much just a temporary measure. Chimera were extremely adaptable, as they had already shown, and it was only a matter of time before they learned how to break Luther's chains without the use of brute strength. Once that happened, everything else would barely hold them for a few moments. Luther, though, was not concerned. More than anyone else at the inn, he thought about how to contain enemies, how to imprison them effectively, how to extract information, and most of all, how to remain safe from them. Even though Lex was getting ready to test the purification and exorcism capability of his newly acquired paladin abilities, he quickly learned they weren't needed. Luther had gained a tremendous amount of knowledge about hells, and as it turned out, possession was a frequent habit of hellions, so naturally Luther had learned proper exorcism. With Fenrir's help, Luther dragged the cloth ball deep into the castle dungeon, even going as far as telling Lex that his help wouldn't be needed to contain them. He claimed that he would first exorcise them, then study them, find their weaknesses, and then use them to help mature the conceptualized torment he had gathered for the hell that he was nurturing for the Midnight Inn. Lastly, once he was done with them, he would submit their corpses to the greenhouse to be used as fertilizer. It was very much an extremely cold-hearted and efficient use of one's enemy, and Lex expected nothing less from Luther. That allowed Lex time to study his clone, and any changes it underwent during his time in the ruins. But as Lex sat down in a room, ready to begin working, he could help but pause. He had a feeling, not one from his instincts, but one he got from his memory. Lex couldn't help but feel that he and it were in a game of chess, an extremely elaborate game of chess, almost like a game of Go, one that spanned many levels and layers, and had a depth and complexity to it that was easy to overlook. Lex's hair stood up on end and he got goosebumps as he considered a certain possibility, one that struck him purely because he felt a sense of familiarity from it. Lex couldn't help but feel that allowing him to capture the chimera was something that it wanted all along, as if it was laying a trap for him far in the future. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. The very presence of it, the fact that it was obsessed with him and his karma, the fact that it was studying him just so that it could take him down, all of it felt too coincidental. Now Lex was no stranger to weird coincidences, but he'd hardly ever come across one so obviously blatant. Lex kept getting the feeling that it had something to do with the Go board in his mind, but he hadn't seen his mysterious opponent make a move in a long time. Or could it be that he had been making moves, but they just weren't visible to Lex? He frowned. Such a line of thought was going down the path to paranoia, which was not a habit Lex wanted to pick up. At the same time, Lex trusted his instincts, and more importantly, trusted himself. The question, then, was that if his opponent really was making invisible moves against him, how could he verify it? Lost deep in thought, Lex couldn't help but to tap his middle finger on the desk beside him. His clone started doing the same. Chapter 1676, Game of Life System. Within the Artica realm, Axios was smiling softly as he played with the piece of divine ore in his hand. For reasons unknown to those at his level, a name had not been decided for the ore, and no one was allowed to name it either. Even nicknames weren't allowed, so for now it was simply being addressed as the divine ore, which was not really a name, it was just what it was. The unusual situation from the name aside, the existence of this ore had caused a massive upheaval across the universe, and Axios had been in the perfect place to take advantage of it. It did not take long for him to establish various alliances centered around the trade of this ore, bolstering his own position within his race and creating strong allies for himself. Life was very much a game of transactions, and sometimes helping others was the best way to help oneself. All the deals he made seemed to favor the natives of the Artica race, but that was only because no one knew what he stood to gain from it. The goodwill of the races, an increased diplomatic standing, and steadfast allies were all things that would give him long-term returns compared to something like immediate wealth benefit. What no one knew was that even those were merely add-on bonuses for Axios. What he really wanted by creating more allies for himself were the go pieces they would provide. He had to admit, he severely underestimated his opponent this time when he challenged that human. Not only had he become cognizant of the Go board much quicker than anyone else he had ever encountered, he had learned the basic rules fairly quickly as well. His counterattacks, while somewhat basic, were also swift and lethal, and put Axios in a temporarily disadvantaged position. But the thing about this Go board was that it was more complex than simply gaining a piece every time one advanced oneself. Axios turned his attention to his system interface. More specifically, he looked at the title of his system at the very top of the interface panel. It read, Game of Life System. The game they were playing looked like Go, but the pieces materialized whenever one advanced in any way in life. That advancement could be in the form of personal strength, alliances, connections, networks, influence, etc. Essentially, the board did not take into account any such advantages the players had at the time of the initiation of the game, only personal advancements made after the game began. What was especially important was that only personal advancements mattered, not any advancement to any associated organization or power, not unless one openly owned that organization or power. Axios' opponent was winning a lot in life, and with a frequency that was completely abnormal. Axios even suspected that he had left the Artica realm and moved to another realm with a faster flow of time. But that was only a temporary advantage. After all, this game was not a quick one. In a competition between the two of them making advancements in life, they also had to strategically use those advancements to counter one another. The Go board directly pitted their lives against one another, so this was entirely possible. At the same time, a higher level of gameplay was to attract enemies for one another. When Axios figured that his opponent might be in another realm, he tried using one of his special, system-given, one-time use pieces to attract an enemy for his opponent. Never in his wildest dreams had he imagined how effective that would be. Instead of new pieces for Axios being placed on the board, many places within the board became trap locations visible only to Axios. As long as his human opponent placed a bead on one of those trap locations, he would further intertwine his life with threats directly targeting him. Such a trap was especially effective against his opponent who had recently begun to place a lot of beads on the board. In the meantime, Axios was biding his time, gathering up his own beads, gearing up for one massive counterattack. After all, the game of life was not a pointless one, and Axios could vouch for that. The winner would reap all the benefits that the loser had accumulated across their life, instantly providing them with a windfall. It was only through constantly defeating opponents that Axios had arrived at this position today. He had started out as nothing more than an abandoned child, living in the wild, barely scraping by. Once he got his system, though, he defeated one opponent after another, gaining their strengths, their skills, their wealth, their connections, rising all the way to his current position. Now he had a feeling that after beating this current opponent, he'd be set for all the way to the peak of the immortal realm. The more formidable he was, the greater Axios' gain would be. Likewise, because he was so formidable, Axios could not take things lightly. Although he had an advantage now, he couldn't be complacent. After all, each obstacle also served as an opportunity, and one could turn a disaster into a massive windfall if they placed their pieces correctly. Although right now it seemed like his opponent was digging a bigger and bigger hole for himself to jump into, he had proven that he could overcome obstacles, so what Axios had to do now was ensure he jumped into that hole. He flipped the piece of ore in the air, thinking about his next move. It had to be just right, and it had to come at a critical time. Until then, Axios would only gather more and more pieces, waiting for the time to counterattack. Since only he could see which positions deepened the trap for his opponent, he began to plan out the positions for his own pieces that would force his opponent to enter deeper and deeper into the trap, attracting more and more troubles for himself. He flipped the ore once more. Chapter 1677, Bold Steps. Lex spent several hours going over everything he had learned about the Go board in his mind, and placing pieces and everything else, yet he could find nothing to suggest that there was any correlation between it and it. In fact, his opponent hadn't even placed a single bead on the board in a while. But he could not shake the feeling that the sudden shift in how it behaved was not normal. It was suddenly a lot more active in trying to hunt him down, and was possibly even laying traps for him. After all, if the Chimera really were as formidable as claimed, then their capture was way too easy. Whatever the case, Abaddon was becoming increasingly dangerous for them, and the more time they spent here, the more dangerous it would become. With that said, Lex turned his attention towards his clone and began to study it. He studied how he had been influenced by the ruins, the remnant energies on his body, the influence of time, and how the frequent use of those characters had affected it. Most important to Lex's own research was studying the remnant auras still lingering on the clone's body. That, alongside the studies Lex had done through his clone on the ruins themselves, would help Lex better understand how Abaddon treats constants. According to Lex's theory, while Abaddon was in a constant flux, there were certain constant points within it. The jungle they had come from was one such point, and the ruins were examples of other such constant points. Lex believed that the location of the chalice was yet another such constant point. Once Lex understood more about these points, finding them would become easier. All Lex would have to do then was figure out how to influence the ever-changing landscape to those constant points. How hard could that be? Very hard. Although Lex joked about these things, the way Abaddon operated and its underlying principles were far beyond what Lex could comprehend at his level. What he had to do was find patterns at the lowest level, which was a nigh impossible task since the very nature of Abaddon was chaos. Time seemed to pass by quickly, the minutes and days melding into each other. As an immortal, the passage of time had less meaning, and so it was easier to get lost in deep activities. Years did not mean nearly as much as significant events, so most immortals did not measure the passage of time by years, but rather by events. Yet another reason why Lex was only 25 years old, because years literally stopped mattering after that. The night was approaching an end, and it had slowed down the attack since the Chimera were captured. As a result, there was a relative ease everyone felt. In fact, they started to prepare for their departure once the day came. It had been a while since the mercenaries searched Abaddon for their goal, and it was about time they resumed their search. It was around this time, right before the break of dawn, that something finally changed for Lex. He was naturally using the state of flow to help his study of the aura remnants on his clone, sifting through the traces of the laws, when he sensed something completely alien. Lex scrunched his brows and tried to recall what he sensed, for it had been fleeting. But even the memory of it was strange. It was like he was trying to capture mist within his fist. It just wasn't possible. Then he sensed it again, and this time the feeling lasted longer. At steady intervals, the feeling came and left, almost as if it were mimicking the rhythm of a beating heart. What the bloody hell? Lex muttered as he stared at his clone, unable to identify what the feeling was and why it was coming from his clone. "What have you been up to?" he asked his clone, who looked at Lex lamely. "I was relaxing on Lover's Island," the clone responded sarcastically. "What do you think I've been up to?" "Nothing." That's what. The banter between Lex and his clone was just a random way to blow off steam, something he usually did as Jack, but his fairy clone, who was searching for divine or while plagued with a wretched stink, could not really blow off a lot of steam these days. Either way, the situation completely bewildered Lex. Until, at last, the feeling became much stronger, lasting much longer, which caused Lex's tenet to ache, as if it was being overused. Suddenly, Lex had an epiphany, even as he relaxed his concentration and allowed his tenet to rest. Lex was ready to become a heaven immortal, but was resisting the call of a higher realm which was affecting him. The presence of the pineapple seal especially allowed him to last much longer in a lower realm, subsequently causing the call to become ever stronger. The longer Lex resisted the call, the greater his influence and understanding over laws would be. It seemed now that he had crossed some kind of threshold, which finally allowed him to sense the deeper, hidden laws of the universe which normally only heaven immortals could sense. Since his mind hadn't been tempered by the tribulation, he could not yet understand those laws. That didn't change the fact that he could now vaguely sense them. It was just that such an exposure affected his tenet severely, but not to the level where it was dangerous. Lex smiled, and planned out his training regime. If he kept exposing himself to these higher laws like this, his cultivation technique would allow him to adapt and get used to its pressure. This way, he could peek at those laws that were out of his reach, and maybe uncover some of Abaddon's secrets. At the same time, he felt a new bead being formed in his mind, so as always, he placed it on the go board, encircling his opponent's beads. One way or another, he would resolve the situation with Abaddon and conquer this go board as well. Neither of those things were going to happen by being shy, so he would have to take bold steps. Chapter 1678, Good News and Good News? When dawn finally arrived, the mercenaries were ready to march out, and a majority of the inn staff were also ready to move forward. There were just a couple of issues. The first issue was the small matter of 100 chimeras within the castle dungeons. They couldn't exactly be made to march out in the open, and while technically they could be left inside the castle while it shrunk to its snow globe form, that would drastically weaken the castle, making it much more likely for the chimeras to escape. But this was a foreseeable problem that everyone had already been working on resolving even before dawn arrived, so it couldn't really be called an issue. It was more like an irritating inconvenience. The second, much more unexpected issue was that Lex was laying in a hot tub, muttering to himself, unwilling to come out. When he had been told that they were ready to leave, he simply requested Cayman come and visit him first. This unusual behavior from Lex confused many, but they weren't too concerned about it either. They simply informed Cayman, who quickly arrived in the hot tub room. "No lava bath this time?" Cayman asked as he entered the room and looked at Lex. "Well, technically, ice can be classified as a rock, in which case water can also be classified as lava," said Lex while staring up at the ceiling. His voice sounded strained, which concerned Cayman. "Are you okay?" the magma lion asked, ignoring the absolutely absurd claim that water was lava. "In that case, couldn't mineral-rich magma just be called a warm electrolyte drink?" Wait a minute, as a magma lion, he did drink those to help him replenish critical minerals after exerting himself. Could it really be true? No, wait, he was getting distracted. Yes, I'm fine," said Lex, waving his hand. "I just have a migraine from staring too long at something I shouldn't have been looking at. More importantly, I have an update on my research into the space of Abaddon." "That's great news," Cayman exclaimed. "No wait, is it great news? Is the reason you're in your current state because you discovered something terrible?" Lex turned and looked at Cayman with an amused smile. No, nothing like that. Who knew you had such an active imagination? What I discovered. Well, there's a piece of good news, and another piece of news that could be considered either good or bad, depending on one's point of view. Which do you want to hear first? The good news, Cayman said firmly. I found a trace of a pattern. It's buried in laws that only heaven immortals can usually perceive, but due to my unique situation of resisting the tribulation to the next major realm, I can see hints of those laws as well. Given enough time, I should be able to discern exactly how to locate the constants within a baton, a constant being a fixed, constant place, such as the jungle or ruins. I think the chalice should be in one such constant place. That's not good news, that's great news. So then, what's the bad news? Well, as of right now, I can only see hints of those laws. But the longer I resist the tribulation, the stronger my ability to see those laws will be. The stronger my ability to sense those laws, the quicker I'll be able to learn how to interpret those laws, and then fully comprehend the pattern hidden within the constants. It might take me years, maybe even decades to fully discern the pattern. Mere decades to see through a baton sounds like good news to me. Why would that be bad news? Spoken like a true immortal, Lex scoffed. I'm only 25 years old. Spending decades here is akin to spending time equal to my entire life here. More importantly, the pineapple on my forehead has only 29 years left. If we don't finish before then, my next major tribulation will arrive and I'll be forced to enter the heaven immortal realm. If that happens, then the kinds of enemies we'll attract won't be as simple as the ones we've been facing so far. Cayman's expression finally changed as he understood that they were on a deadline of some kind if they were to depend solely on Lex. If someone else could find a quicker way to find a baton, then maybe they could find it even sooner. Unfortunately, he had no idea how he might be able to do that. The only good piece of news is that the flow of time here is so messed up that even decades here might just be a few months, or at most a few years back in the origin realm. That's if nothing else changes in a baton, and the flow of time here remains like it has been so far. In that case, I propose a change in strategy, Cayman said. Instead of searching for the chalice, let's begin searching for treasures that can increase your comprehension speed as well as increase your mental strength so you can endure the burden of looking at the higher level of laws longer. This way, we might be able to speed up the process of you understanding the pattern. Lex sighed once again. It seemed like no one cared about his passing youth. Yeah, I guess that's a good strategy, he said, and then got out of the hot tub. I suppose we should start as soon as possible. Each second counts. While Lex was lamenting the possibility of being trapped with a baton for years more, Skipping changed his posture, sleeping upside down, wiping the drool dripping down his cheek as he did. The constant sound of flowing water, and the dense, energy-rich environment made this the coziest sleep he'd ever had. He could probably continue sleeping for years if no one interrupted him. His prize stamp, which allowed him to teleport items anywhere in the universe, sat silently within his system inventory. Chapter 1679, Foundational and Relational Laws. There were many things that Lex did which were extremely confusing, and mentally strenuous. However, living simultaneously in two different flows of time was actually one of the insanely complicated things that he had gotten used to. It didn't matter at all that in 1 second of Jack's life, wherein he may not have even finished pronouncing a single word, Lex lived for days or weeks. He had to maintain perfect reaction speed in both flows of time, making sure that he didn't speak too quickly as Jack or too slowly as Lex. It was the same for his every action and interaction. Despite how unfathomable it sounded, that was something Lex had mastered pretty easily. He even managed to keep updated on the happenings of the Midnight Inn, which was operating in a third flow of time. The thing that was actually bothering him was studying the aura remnants on his clone. In fact, Lex had dismissed his clone long ago. He simply captured the remnant aura, and continued to study it over time. Studying deeper laws was a headache, not only because it caused him a headache, but because he didn't understand what it meant for laws to be deeper. It was more or less easy to understand that laws had a hierarchy that seemed to be a running theme with everything in the universe, from races, to energies, to, apparently, even laws. But such a thing clashed with his understanding of laws. When Lex looked at the universe through his tenet, he saw endless chains. Each chain was a law, and there were countless chains attached to everything. The very existence of a thing depended on laws, and similarly how it behaved depended not only on the law associated with it, but how that law reacted to other laws. For example, the law of fire was independent of the law of heat, and often enough, they worked in correlation with each other. Yet Lex had also seen blue flames called cryoflames, which worked with laws of cold, among other things. So if the existence of laws were so integral to all of reality, how could there be laws which were hidden, or deeper, whatever that meant? Of course, Lex already had the theoretical answer for that since he had looked into the heaven immortal realm. He didn't really need to ask others, though he also did that, anyway. He originally thought that deeper laws probably meant that these were the laws that created the base laws of the universe. That was wrong. Surprisingly, the person within the castle who had the deepest understanding of these things, and gave Lex a very detailed explanation, was not Cayman or any other warrior. Instead, it was Jeeves, the tailor who had decided to accompany them on this adventure. One cannot make a good suit unless one has an in-depth understanding of the metaphysical aspects of the universe, Jeeves said as he pulled out a roll of measuring tape and asked Lex to stand on a pedestal. Raise your arms and hold them there. You've gained a bit of weight on your conscience and I need to redo your measurements for your future suits. Anyway, what was I saying? Oh yes, the universe. It's a pretty interesting place with a fine variety of materials for suits. 10 out of 10, I would recommend living within it. Jeeves lifted Lex's arms a little higher, as if he was dissatisfied with his posture. Now, any material at all is absolutely worthless if one does not understand the laws that relate to it, which is why I've studied this topic in great depth. In basic syntax, the laws of the universe are divided into 3 layers. The first and most basic layer, which is what Earth immortals are exposed to, are called the foundational laws. In essence, they dictate the inherent nature of everything in existence. I don't believe I need to go in more detail about that, do I? Now stand up straight and flex your muscles as much as possible. I need to make sure they haven't gotten smaller. The elasticity of your suit needs to be sufficient to suit your body, but not too much either. Now, as I was saying, the layers. After the foundational laws comes the second layer, which heaven immortals can sense. These laws are called the relational laws. These laws are highly contextual, and highly dynamic. They bridge the gap between foundational laws and more metaphysical, higher-order concepts. One such example is cause and effect. The very fact that independent laws can interact with one another is based on cause and effect. Then there are certain laws such as the law of potential, the law of balance, the law of contrast, the law of life, the law of death, and so on. Karma, a very popular and famous law, appears as if it is a foundational law, since Earth immortals can sense it. Yet when you become a heaven immortal, you will discover that it is also a relational law. However, when you become a celestial immortal, you'll discover that karma also has traces of its existence in the law of tether, one of the 8 ruling laws. Irrespective of what karma, and such similar concepts, truly are, you will discover that foundational law, without the presence and support of relational laws, cannot do anything at all. Take, for example, this suit I made for you, Jeeves said, showing Lex a mannequin wearing a torn, shredded suit. It was not originally like this, but had become so after one of Lex's very intense life and death fights. For some reason, seeing how Jeeves still kept the suit made Lex feel guilty for what had happened to it. But it wasn't like it was his fault someone tried to kill him, right? Using very valuable materials, I imbued this particular suit with the law of correspondence. The defensive capability of this suit corresponds to the defensive quotient of your own body. It was a very ingenious design, I have to admit. How was I supposed to know that you would challenge some followers of a dying deity to a match and allow them to tear up this suit with great efforts, only to realize that your own defense was so much better than the suit? Oh. this was that suit. It seemed like Jeeves had found out what Lex had done that day. The look he was giving Lex was. Lex coughed, and pretended like he wasn't fazed by the tailor's expression and just continued to listen. Chapter 1680, Gone Race. Lex listened to Jeeves for a long while, and came up with his own descriptions of foundational and relational laws. Foundational laws were loosely similar to the laws of science he studied back on Earth, very, very loosely. On Earth he studied the nature of all objects and their behaviors under different circumstances. The foundational laws were basically just the rules that dictated that nature and behavior. Relational laws, on the other hand, were more metaphysical, and could not really be studied. Or, well, maybe quantum physics studied those things, but since Lex had never studied it back on Earth, he wasn't familiar with what it covered. But the point was, based on how Lex understood it, relational laws were more conceptual in nature. In a way, that made sense. No wonder he wasn't able to understand Abaddon at all using merely foundational laws. Now, all he needed to do was get used to observing and interacting with relational laws, learn how to understand them, and pick out the pattern between them. Simple. Fortunately, while Abaddon was a place of unimaginable danger, it was similarly a place teeming with treasures. Since they had changed their objective from searching for the chalice to searching for treasures, their task was much easier. In fact, treasure hunting was one of the favorite tasks a mercenary could take on. This was not stereotyping, or anything of the sort. Mercenaries were not all good-hearted people dying to dedicate themselves to a cause. They were people who wanted money, and wouldn't be afraid to fight for it. The particular batch of mercenaries in Abaddon were extremely loyal to the condottiere, but that didn't mean all mercenaries were like that. But all mercenaries did have a fascination with, and attraction to treasure so strong they'd risk their lives for it. Such a disposition naturally meant that they had the requisite skills to go treasure hunting. The only real obstacle was not being killed by the treasures themselves. That very day, once they set out from their location, they traveled from the glaciers to a barren land, devoid of a single blade of grass. The ground was hard and cracked. So long had it existed like this that the soil had turned to stone. When the wind blew through the cracks in the ground, instead of whistling, the wind whimpered, as if it was afraid. The deep red sky became even richer in color, and seemed to bleed out onto the land and the horizon, though anyone could tell that was a mere illusion. The sky wasn't bleeding, it was merely raining blood over there. As ominous a place as that seemed, that was exactly the kind of place which would be filled with countless treasures, so they marched directly towards the rain of blood. Z, the most astute of the group, naturally understood that this was an elaborate setup by Lex to enter into the next phase of his training. They had a deadline, a looming threat, and needed to find just the right treasures that would help Lex uncover the secrets of this place. How convenient. But he didn't complain. He simply adopted what he called horror movie mentality and ran headfirst towards the place that screamed gruesome death waiting here. As a surprise to absolutely no one, the region where it was raining blood was filled with macabre monstrosities, their bodies made entirely out of blood and guts. Just as the locusts were interested in their souls, and the wraiths were interested in their bodies, these bloody things were interested in their spirits. The worst part was that all of these creatures were just clumps gathered from the numerous corpses that filled the area, possessed by a particularly forbidding will. It was similar to the hunger that filled all the locusts, but instead of hunger, it seemed to find its origins in pain and eternal, unending psychological pain that knew no respite. The sight of those creatures caused apprehension in the mercenaries, but nothing beyond what they could handle. Even bloody gut monsters were better than chimera in their eyes. Oddly enough, the sight of those monsters drew the biggest reaction from the members of the Midnight Inn. An undeniable fear and hate gripped each and every single one of the members of the Midnight Inn who had arrived here, including Lex. The experience was extremely confusing, because those feelings seemed to originate from the very core of their being. Fear and hate. It affected every single human and even the beast who had transformed into a human, Malfoy. Lex, who was sitting on the shoulder of the midnight mech, paused his meditation and turned his attention towards the corpses on the ground. There wasn't enough of a single corpse left to allow them to distinguish what the whole body must have looked like. But by observing hundreds, even thousands of corpses, and fitting their pieces together in his mind, he drew up an image. These corpses, before they were butchered, looked like gorillas. Their size was not bigger, nor were they bulkier than normal gorillas. If there was any difference at all in their body structure, it was that their skeletal structure was more similar to a human, meaning they likely stood on and walked on two legs. Oh, and instead of hair covering their body, they had gray, metallic spikes. Even so, they looked fairly similar to a gorilla. Why would their appearance strike fear in their hearts? Since Lex did not recognize the race, he conjured an image and appeared in front of Cayman. "Do you recognize this race?" Lex asked, his expression stern. "They don't seem like they're from Abaddon. This is the first sign of outsiders we've encountered so far." "Yeah, that's the Gone race," Cayman said, recognizing the image at a glance. "Their race is a follower of the path of chaos. Although we haven't really faced them, learning about the top races from the path of chaos is mandatory for the Reaving Dread." Cayman paused, and turned to look towards Lex. One of their most significant historical achievements was to eliminate the last of the human Dow Lords. Chapter 1681, Bloody Hell. "Gone race?" Lex repeated. He had somehow never heard the name, nor did he know the details of them eliminating human Dow Lords. However, that information alone allowed him to understand some of what was happening. Irrespective of independent strength or weakness, one would always be bound by the position of their race in the universe. If the Gone race was responsible for hunting down the human race's Dow Lords, then they were responsible for dropping the human race's position on the cosmic ascendant spectrum. They had simultaneously established themselves as predators against the human race, forever gaining an advantage against them. Those of the Midnight Inn were not weak in strength or character, so a little fear and hate would not stop them from doing what they needed to do. But it was an undeniable fact that members of the Gone race would have some advantage over them. It was quite curious that he would encounter them here, in Abaddon of all places. Furthermore, "They're from the path of chaos, you say?" Lex asked. He had heard a lot about the path of order and chaos. In fact, the Tower of Providence, from where he obtained Taro's fertilizer, the thing that allowed him to expedite the birth of the Midnight Realm, was an agent of the path of order. Back then, the Tower of Providence, which had also marked Lex as an agent of the path of order. The explanation it had given Lex about its function was that it tried to subtly reduce the impact of the agents of the path of chaos, giving life a greater chance of survival. Back then, when Lex's cultivation level was negligible, and his knowledge of the universe was non-existent, such an explanation was sufficient. Now, though, he severely doubted that things were so straightforward. Yeah, the path of order and the path of chaos are diametrically opposed. Whether they know it or not, there is no being that is not a part of either path. They have a complicated relationship, one filled with predictable animosity. However, since the path of chaos is about just as strong as the path or order, they avoid direct confrontations. Something like that would probably destroy a lot of realms, and that wouldn't benefit anyone. "Is there anything specifically you can tell me about the Gone race? Anything that might explain why they're here?" Lex asked. Although he would need to increase his knowledge on the path of chaos, now was hardly the time. Besides, rather than learning about the whole path, it was much more time efficient to learn about the foes right in front of him. "Nothing that stands out, honestly," Cayman said with a shrug. "There's no reason for anyone to be in Abaddon, let alone the Gone race, so I can't help you. Who even knows how old these are? For all we know, these could be eons old." "You're right. Let's keep moving," said Lex, though he sensed a subtle danger from the Gone race's existence here. He couldn't help but think back to the Go board once more. He had a feeling that, because of the Go board, he might end up facing them. The danger Lex sensed wasn't from the Gone race, it was from the interference potential of the board. He really needed to work on getting rid of it somehow. As they delved deeper into the region covered by blood rain, they continued to face bloody monsters, yet that alone was not enough to cause them serious problems. Lex returned to studying the aura of Abaddon, and since the region covered in blood rain bore signs of being one of the constants within Abaddon, Lex began to study it seriously. As a result, he was exposed to the relational laws more easily, which caused him to need to rest more frequently. Coincidentally, this bloody place was actually a bloody wonderland filled with numerous valuable treasures if one ignored the stench of blood on them. There were certain plants made seemingly out of blood, and upon touching them one could absorb them into their body. The plant would revitalize and even strengthen the body, but not much else. Then there were random occurrences of aurora lights, and upon entering the lights, one would have their spirit refreshed and even refined. Both those were a great help in relieving some of the fatigue Lex would accumulate during his studies. It was almost like he was back to his college days, where studying would cause him exhaustion, and only pizza and a good movie could revive him. Of course, there were also countless treasures that all of them were too weak to harvest. Even Lex dared not touch the glowing bones, nor could they even dream of coming close to the rain of green blood. Being covered in red blood was enough, they all had a feeling that the slightest touch of that green blood would cause them all to die. Similarly, they ran into blue blood which would drain them of their spirit energy and weaken their bodies. Just as there was blood of various colors, there were bloody creatures of various colors as well. Each one had to be dealt with in a different way, requiring them to use all sorts of methods. For once, Z was actually impressed. He could not even imagine how Lex had arranged such a versatile training regimen for him. He was forced to acknowledge the level of effort Lex was putting into this, which forced him to work even harder. Once, they even encountered invisible blood. That wasn't harmful at all, or so they thought. It didn't harm them or their bodies one bit. Instead, it simply melted off all clothes. Dealing with that rain was so serious that Lex actually made a move himself, covering all of them in a barrier and preventing them from suffering through any traumatizing events. Although, Z's back tattoo was exposed. Lex didn't ask him about it, especially since he himself had a lotus tattoo on his back that came and went as it wished. But Lex couldn't help but feel that the little guy was looking up to him, and copying him. That actually made him feel a little touched. And also, like a bad role model. Bloody hell, gotta watch out what I do in front of the kids from now on. Previous index. Plus, turn off reset. Chapter 1682, Bobblings. Lex resumed his studies on Abaddon, but they did not spend long within the blood rain. Something peculiar happened when they entered the blood rain. The flow of time in Abaddon became exactly the same as the Midnight Realm. The same had happened in the jungle, so Lex began to suspect that if they entered just locations within Abaddon, it would always affect the flow of time. Such a thing was not good for any of them, though the reaving dread did not seem to mind as much. Lex, though, would prefer to come back to the inn as quickly as possible. While there existed a possibility that he might spend a few decades within Abaddon, it would be best if only a short time had passed within the Midnight Realm. So they left. While the area with the blood rain was filled with treasures that could help him, so was the rest of Abaddon, so no one minded. They faced obstacles, and not just a few. They faced enemies, and during their respite from those enemies they faced locusts. The dark night made another appearance, and it came every night. Amidst the constant fight for their life, they occasionally also encountered strange oddities and unusual sights. They encountered no ruins, or anything like that, though once they saw a citadel far off on the horizon. Its mere presence radiated such immense danger that they all turned back and headed in the opposite direction. That was not something mere mortals could explore. Like this, with new adventures and dangers abound, days, weeks and even months went by. The only thing that any of them were grateful for was that they did not encounter another event where new souls were sucked into Abaddon. During this entire time, Lex constantly kept an eye on the inn, as well as members of Obsidian for anyone who could help them speed up their process in any way, but found nothing. Sending things to Abaddon was easier said than done, and even the rhino centaurs failed in this task. "Yes, 2 more scoops of ice cream on the pancake please," Skipping said in his sleep, a wide grin on his face. If one were to see him at that moment, they would discover that he seemed like he was having the best dream, and didn't look like he would be waking up any time soon. His system sent him a notification for he had missed several days of shopping, but he ignored it. Unfortunately, skipping would soon learn that one does not just ignore their system, a lesson he had already learned and forgotten too many times. "Nay, it cannot be," they whispered in the dead of night. But it was. "It was," said a bobling, a name fondly adopted by members of the Bob fan club. "No, it lacks feeling." "You're lacking a certain oomph," said the second bobling who was judging the performance of the first. "You need to make me feel it." "Yeah, that's what I thought too," said the first as he began to scratch something off from a script in his hand. "For the love of Bob, will you two knock it off and help me put out this fire?" roared a third bobling as he sprayed a fire extinguisher at the roaring flames spreading across the sails. Behind them, the Jolly Rancher was in a fire fight against 13 vessels who were shooting lasers, cannons, spiritual techniques, and everything else they could. Unfortunately, the hull of the Rancher was not easily breached. That was exactly why another dozen ships had decided to board the ship and forcefully wrest control away from Jack. It almost seemed like all of the Arctica realm was conspiring against them, and it kind of was. Like, it was legit confirmed that they were conspiring against them because Bob had basically announced at breakfast that it would take the efforts of the whole realm to mildly inconvenience their captain. Well, he was definitely inconvenienced now, though the scale of it was up to debate. The two boblings looked at the third, then at the fire, and then at the dozens of enemies who had boarded the ship and were fighting the crew. "You know, I think it's the sour jawbreakers. They just curled a tongue in a certain way, perfect for monologuing," said Bobling 1 as he picked up a bucket and threw water at the flaming sails. "That's an interesting theory. I will propose it at next week's gathering," said Bobling 2 as he held out his leg and tripped a running beast. Next week's gathering should have fresh barbecue, or I will kick you all off the ship," said Monk, the bear cub as he used his sharp claws to shave off the head of the ship's attackers, leaving them all bald. "Can you all focus? We need to find the captain and get out of here," exclaimed Ollie, possibly the only sane member of the crew. "I agree with Ollie," said Tiny Sparkles, standing atop his mount, a medium-sized hippo. Well, technically the hippo was one of the ship's invaders, but since he made a good mount for Tiny Sparkles, no one had the heart to tell him that this was slavery and that was frowned upon. "The captain went out with Bob, so in his absence, I will fill in," exclaimed Pebbles, who had all his limbs today, but had an upside-down bucket instead of a head. Naturally, since he didn't actually have lips, and couldn't actually speak, no one really heard him, and only saw him posing. "How about we put out the damn fire before discussing this?" roared Bobling 3 as he turned the fire extinguisher from the sail towards himself. His hair had caught on fire now, and no one else seemed to care. "Speaking of missing people, has anyone seen Longbeard?" asked Bobling 1. The question had no sooner been asked that the crew saw Goldilocks flying through the air attacking ships, with only the ends of a beard tying it and keeping it attached to the ship. "Never mind, I think I found him." Chapter 1683, Entering the Trial Under Duress. There were days when Jack loved Bob. Well, not really. In truth, there were days where Jack kind of tolerated Bob's existence a little more than normal. Then there were days where he hated Bob. Today was definitely one of the days he hated Bob. "Give up, Jack. Just hand over the divine ore and this can all be over," said the Typhoon Eagle as it clawed at Jack's wings. A fairy's wings were its biggest strength, and its biggest weakness, since it was the source of all its fairy dust. Should something happen to the wings, a fairy would basically be crippled. Jack was a little different from regular fairies, though, in the sense that his wings were tougher than spiritual metal. Instead of blocking the attack, Jack used his wings like a sword to cut the eagle's talons while he himself used the spiritual equivalent of an RPG to shoot at a crystal ship flying off in the distance. Trapped within was an unsuspecting Bob who thought he was on his way to give a seminar on why jelly mattered. "Go find your own divine ore, there's plenty of it to go around," said Jack, avoiding the numerous enemies trying to attack and slow him down. "Yes, but none of it is as refined as the ore found in the shooting stars, and you know it." Of course, Jack knew that. He was the one in possession of all the shooting star ores that had been found so far. He was also the first one to realize that the ore found within the shooting stars was purer than anything anyone else would be able to get on their own. By now, it was fairly common knowledge that the divine ore was, relatively speaking, common enough in the Arctica realm that there was no need for a bloodbath over it. The refined ore was a separate thing though. The more refined the ore was, the more effective it was, and no one could refine it as much as the ores in the shooting stars. Well, no one within the common population's reach, so the frenzy over those pieces had taken the realm by storm. Jack had it all handled, though, until Bob opened his big mouth. How him mentioning a realm-wide conspiracy made it actually happen was anyone's guess, but the entire mortal level had conspired together to get the ore from Jack. Others simply wanted to kidnap Bob. Whatever the case, neither was acceptable, which is why this perfectly perfect day had been ruined for him. Fortunately, Jack was more than able to handle any problems that came his way. Though Jack and Lex used their cultivation in vastly different ways, the experience from Lex still taught Jack an immense amount, and vice versa. In fact, since they were basically the same person, Jack received a constant boost from Lex, gradually raising his own strength. By now, Jack's body was practically a weapon. "Damn it, Jack, don't you see I'm trying to help you? Everyone knows about your plans to become an Earth immortal. Bob's already spilled the beans. As soon as you go to the next level, you won't be as tough up there as you are here. If you still have the ore, you won't survive. Better to leave it down here, where you can get something in exchange." "You're so thoughtful," Jack said sarcastically, right before punching him across the skyline and rushing away to rescue that infernal drama cat. Bob, as it turned out, was happily sharing a story about the time when he was still back in the Midnight Realm and a giant snake hired him to enter into its stomach and search for the Holy Grail. Jack had heard that story before. He initially thought that the story was about the world serpent tricking Bob into its stomach so it could eat him. As it turned out, it was instead a bad mix of a horrendous pun and a juvenile fart joke, since the snake actually wanted him to find the Holy Grail, which was, as one could probably guess by now, a fart. Even mythical beings went through a middle school sense of humor phase, it seemed. That wasn't relevant at the moment, though. Jack grabbed Bob by the ears, stuffed an extra sour jawbreaker into his mouth, and started flying towards the Jolly Rancher. "Listen to me, Bob, and don't say anything," Jack said gravely. "We're going to enter the trial to become Earth immortals, the lot of us. That will take us to the next level. I don't know how deities cultivate or level up, so you have to decide right now whether you'll be joining us or not. Don't speak, just nod for yes, and wave your head for no." Bob wondered for a second if he should tell Jack that he could raise his own cultivation level at will, and didn't need to go through the trial. But then he realized that the captain probably already knew that, and was simply using this as an excuse to spend time together. After all, everyone knows that the real treasure is the memories they made along the way. So he nodded his head. Also, although he had decided to give up being a deity, he established a new rule for his own faith: all drama cats had to become sailors and go treasure hunting. Surely nothing bad would happen from that. Jack, still under fire, fought his way through hordes of enemies, navigated the burning Jolly Rancher through an entire armada of enemy ships, and quickly entered one of the cities, effectively ending the fight. After all, they all knew better than to fight during the city limits. Then, under the regretful gaze of the whole mortal level, the entire crew, along with the 3 ambiguous boblings whose race and origins were a mystery, applied to enter the trial to become an Earth immortal. Either they would succeed and reach the next level, or they would die in the trial. There was no third option. Jack finally breathed a sigh of relief when it was finally done. The threat of death was no stranger to him, but cleaning up Bob's messes really was a full-time job. Maybe he should hire a nanny. Chapter 1684, Liability Waiver. "This is blasphemy." Bob tried to speak despite the jawbreaker in his mouth. That's how upset he was. Unfortunately for him, he was the only one who seemed to have an issue with the situation. "It cannot be helped," explained a prism whale, the one in charge of registering foreigners for the trial in the challenge realm. "All trials are conducted individually. Even if you all enter the challenge realm at the same time, you will all be teleported to your own, independent trials. The most I can accommodate you is to register you all to land in the same zone if you all successfully pass your trials. The nature of the Artica realm was such that beings from higher levels had a modicum of control over lower levels. Of course, that level of control was very limited, and for greater control, one would need to become the ruler of that particular level. With all levels being controlled firmly by the Artica race, they could use their influence to affect certain things. Manipulating where new entrants enter into the new level was something they could easily control. It's okay. I'm certain we all will easily pass through the trials, said Jack. My main concern is for my ship. I can't fit it into a spatial tool of any kind, so how will I transport it between levels? It absolutely can't be left behind. The prism whale turned and looked out the window at the massive wooden ship. As if its design was not impressive enough, the size and sheer presence were breathtaking as well. The Jolly Rancher had accrued some fame across this level of the Artica realm in the past few days, so it was quite well known. Its magnificent size was matched by its durability, for not a single dent nor scratch marred the pristine body of the vessel despite taking countless beatings. Yes, I must admit, your ship is quite magnificent. It is rare to see such fine craftsmanship in the lower levels of Artica. It would indeed be a shame to leave it behind. I can offer you two solutions. You can either park it here, and for a nominal fee, it will be teleported over to the next level once you complete the trial. If, for whatever reason, you cannot complete the trial, then you can designate the next person to inherit the ship on your behalf. The second option is more costly. We can provide a temporary transport seal which will seal your ship in a small, transportable vessel that you can take along with you to the challenge realm. Once you complete your trial, you can take it out of the seal in the next level. However, this way, if something should happen to you within the trial, the ship will be lost to the challenge trial, and no one will be able to claim it. The prism whale seemed genuinely concerned about the ship, and didn't want it to be lost. Jack, however, did not want to leave it behind. Besides, even though the Artica race had a decent reputation about following laws, he didn't want to trust others with his things. I'll have the ship sealed, Jack said, putting down a single gold coin on the table in front of him. The coin was a random one he carved out of wood, then gave to Goldilocks. Goldilocks turned anything it touched into nether lily gold, which was the most conductive metal for spiritual energy that one could basically find at least at a mortal level. Treasures on an immortal level might have a higher conductivity, but that hardly mattered in this context. The gold coin Jack paid was far beyond the price for the seal, but as a nouveau riche fairy, he couldn't be bothered. He had too much gold, anyway. This should also cover our fees to enter the challenge realm. By the way, those three aren't with us, Jack said, pointing to the three mysterious boblings. When he looked at them, all he saw were generic bodies surrounded by mist, making it hard to pick out details. They had literally just shown up one day and claimed to be members of Bob's fan club, something Jack had never heard of before. Somehow, none of the other crew members found anything odd about them, and Bob easily accepted that there was a fan club focused on him, because of course he had a fan club. He probably had many, all filled with enthusiastic little boblings. Although Jack sensed no danger from them, he also knew how to identify a massive red flag. In this context, identifying a red flag was not the same as raising a flag. Neither Jack nor Lex believed in flags. "Oh come on Captain, don't be stingy," said Bobling 3. Bobling 1 and 2 were, once again, practicing their monologuing skills so naturally they had no idea about what was happening around them. Jack simply looked away. Although he was certain that he wouldn't lose the three boblings so easily, at least he didn't want to pay for them to continue stalking Bob. "Keep the change by the way," said Jack. "Oh no, that's not possible. Tipping is highly frowned upon in Artica," said the prism whale. "All workers get paid more than enough for their work. We don't encourage tipping culture here." Jack shrugged. That was completely random, and seemed like it was a jab at someone or something, but since he wasn't a resident of the Artica realm, he wouldn't know. "Please, all of you fill out your forms and sign the liability waivers." Once everything is done, you'll be ready to head on to the challenge realm. The prison whale handed out forms, and while Jack filled his own, the rest of the crew had tiny sparkles fill out theirs. Pebbles, who still had a bucket for a head, and could not hear or speak, had little to no idea what was going on. He was shaking his body around as if to emphasize a point, but no one had any idea what he was saying. Well, Jack could guess what he was saying. Pebbles was trying to take over the position of captain again. It was lucky there was no cannon around, or Jack wouldn't mind tapping him inside again. Chapter 1685, All in the Same Boat. After going through all of the necessary formalities, Jack and the crew were led to a designated teleportation room. Technically, one could enter the challenge realm from anywhere. The Artica realm was divided into multiple levels, with each level allowing only those of a certain cultivation level within. To go from one level to another, they would need to pass through a trial, which was something which would occur in the challenge realm. As soon as anyone felt like they were ready to go to the next level, all they needed to do was reach the peak of their existing cultivation level and try to break through. They would be transported to their trial, and if they succeeded, would not only enter the next level, but smoothly enter the next cultivation level as well. This somehow avoided the tribulations for certain realms as well. This way, if Jack successfully became an Earth Immortal, he would have completely avoided the tribulation one undergoes to enter into the cultivation level without any negative consequences. Naturally, to make up for that, the trial wouldn't be easy either. For a moment, Jack couldn't help but wonder if there was some kind of tribulation one had to endure to become a Tao Lord. If there was one, and the Artica realm could successfully avoid that one too, then this place was far more magical than he had expected. Since no foreigners were allowed to take the trial to become a Tao Lord, it was not a benefit outsiders would be able to enjoy. However, Jack could imagine how this could become a huge bargaining chip for the Artica realm in the future. He pushed all the unnecessary thoughts out of his mind, and looked out at his crew as well as the 3 boblings who had paid themselves to join. "This is the opportunity of a lifetime," said Jack, his voice solemn. "If we get through this, all of us will become Earth Immortals, and our legend will grow even stronger. Just imagine the adventures we can have when we return to the folklore realm. We have already overcome the legend of the river Styx, now imagine what other myths and legends we can overcome." He paused and stared at them. Whether it was fate, or some twist of luck, he'd come to learn that most of the members of his crew couldn't cultivate normally either. Just like him, they had many obstacles preventing them from becoming immortals. Although he never asked their backstories, after spending so much time together, one naturally picks up a few things. Monk, as a means of survival, had attached himself to a bunch of myths and legends about bear cubs. But in most of those stories, the cubs stayed cubs, and were weak. As such, Monk was forever stuck as a bear cub, unable to grow stronger or older. Of course, now that he had left the folklore realm he could probably cultivate normally. But then, he'd also be giving up the many benefits he got from being linked to those legends. Pebbles was cursed. Like, on a very serious note, he was suffering from a very powerful curse which was meant to torture him for all of eternity by constantly healing his body and then dismembering him. The curse was also meant to keep him alive forever, so he would suffer forever. It just so happened that the curse, well, it didn't work as intended. Now, he was just immortal, and invincible, able to heal from all wounds. As a result, he just randomly lost body parts every so often. But since the curse constantly kept resetting the state of his body, it would reset his cultivation as well, forcing him to stay weak forever. Perhaps the rules of the Artica realm might be able to supersede the influence of the curse and allow him to become an immortal. The crystal alligator and Goldilocks both were babies, so it was fair to say that it was too soon to find out if they could cultivate to higher levels. But due to the unique situations with their bodies, Jack was able to guess that they'd never be able to accumulate any energy in their body, for all excess energy would always be used to convert their surroundings into their elements. Once they became immortals and could tap into external energies, they'd finally be able to overcome this handicap. Until then, they'd be stuck the way they were. Maybe, over time, their bloodlines would allow them to grow stronger, but it was too soon to tell. Ollie was normal, and could cultivate. But, it also suffered the same fate as all beasts, where surpassing the limitations of its bloodline was incredibly difficult, so an easy way to raise its realm was more than welcome. Then came tiny Sparkles. Its dwarfism caused its body to contain way too much spiritual energy, to the point where it was basically impossible to absorb more, and so it could not cultivate. If it evolved its horn, it would be able to continue raising its cultivation level like that, but this was a much easier option. Finally, there was Longbeard. Jack knew nothing about him. That gnome was allergic to mentioning its past. Jack assumed he had troubles keeping him from becoming an immortal too because, well, there was a pattern going on and he didn't want to break it. Bob didn't count. He was an anomaly, and Jack wouldn't be surprised if he could raise his cultivation level at will. Nah, that was too ridiculous even for him. But as a deity, Jack was sure it wasn't easy growing stronger. It probably depended on accumulating a lot of faith and stuff. Completing a trial was much simpler. So, all in all, he and his crew were all in the same boat in more ways than one. This was an opportunity none of them could miss. Hopefully, they'd all succeed in their trials too. "I'll see you all on the other side," Jack said. "And I'll still be captain on that side too. Don't think you can steal my position once you become immortals." "It's not happening." Jack smiled, planting that small idea in their heads. Now they'd all be hoping to overthrow him as soon as they became immortals. Maybe that would give them motivation to pass their trials. He closed his eyes, and pushed his cultivation a bit. Then, he was teleported to the challenge realm, isolating him from the effects of the karmic curse which were about to kick in. Chapter 1686, The cringe is strong with this one. The teleportation between realms was perfect, so if it had happened anywhere else, Jack might not have immediately noticed. Yet the moment he was teleported into the challenge realm, he knew it and his eyes flashed open. The reason was simple. The reeking, rancid smell that plagued his karma disappeared. Jack had not been expecting that to happen, but the moment it did, he fell to his knees and tears started welling up in his eyes. So overwhelmed was he that it actually took him a moment to gather himself back up. Jack didn't know what to expect from his trial, mainly because, based on his understanding, all trials were personalized and there was no predictable pattern to them. Jack, for example, had lived a short but eventful life, but he was probably not using his power to its full potential. The way fairies used spiritual energy was so overpowered that it seemed a little broken to Jack, and even after living as a fairy for so long, he often discovered that he had underestimated the scope of his abilities. In essence, a majority of his power came from his fairy dust, which came from his wings. As long as he had the intention to do something, he could produce fairy dust with the appropriate properties to make it happen. This was such a broad concept that Jack could not cope with it sometimes. For example, as a human, before Lex could teleport, he needed to become aware of space, and then learn to use it. He needed to gain an affinity for it, and then use various spiritual techniques that allowed him to use space in multiple ways. As a fairy, there was no such thing as an affinity for space, or anything else. As long as he willed it, his fairy dust could take on the properties of space, and then how he used that fairy dust is what limited the scope of his abilities. The possibilities were endless. The way he saw it, with such frightening abilities, fairies should be one of the most revered races in the universe, because that versatility of will was eerily similar to a dragon bending the universe to their will. But the difference was that this was what the fairies were capable of after suffering a severe karmic curse that killed off any chance for fairies to grow stronger, and just generally live either oppressed or enslaved lives. He could not even imagine what the fairies were capable of at the height of their powers. Jack looked at his surroundings and found himself standing alone on a concrete path, with no real surroundings. It wasn't as if he was standing in darkness, but instead as if the things that should have surrounded him had been ripped away. In fact, even the path before him seemed to meander around, finding a way through, however narrow, between all that had been ripped away around him. Jack wore a solemn expression as he took his first steps, for he had a theory about what he was seeing. His theory didn't come from himself, but seemed to emanate from his surroundings, as if the absence of things was communicating to him. Or maybe it was the inherent instincts of a fairy. Jack felt like surrounding him should have been the natural endowments of a fairy, all the things that the race should have been entitled to, or was born with. Their abilities, their strengths, their uniquenesses. All of them had been ripped away from them at the very core of their existence, leaving them with nothing. No, not nothing. They were left with less than nothing, for some kind of karmic curse was left to weigh them down, as if to ensure they could never rise up to take back what was rightfully theirs. Jack, from the very core of his being, felt the unprecedented depth of cruelty from the absence all around him. Even the path that he was walking now was only barely left behind, if only because the universe did not allow it to disappear. He did not know if walking this path counted as his trial, for it wasn't hard. Then again, maybe he wasn't actually walking the path. Maybe he was just being made aware that his path to progress hadn't been entirely eliminated, just that it existed as a bare sliver. As soon as he had that thought, his surroundings changed, and he was no longer walking the narrow path. Instead, he was sitting with legs folded in front of a very, very old fairy, as could be determined by the many wrinkles of his face. "Are you ready?" the old fairy asked. "Yes, I am," Jack said. "Wait, am I ready for what?" The old fairy looked at him like he was an idiot. "For your marriage, of course. You're about to marry old man Simons." Jack froze. What the hell kind of trial was this? The old fairy picked up his wooden cane and bonked Jack's head. "Idiot, I was talking about your trial. Are you ready to hear the details of your trial? What else did you expect from the challenge realm?" Oh, I mean, yes. I am ready to hear about the details of the trial," Jack said, feeling unbelievably relieved that the old fairy had just been pulling his leg. "The fairies are one of the oldest races in existence, and our affinity with the Path of Order is so immense that we were actually one of the founding members," the old fairy said, his expression softening back to his original state. "But that is old news now, and there is no point in living in past glories. What you need to know is that nothing resonates with a fairy more than joy. Nothing. It is for that reason that the curse upon us is specifically designed to deprive us of joy, and our ability to provide joy. In your path ahead, you must stick closely to joy. It is at the core of fairies more than anything else, and so long as we exist, this is a truth that can never be changed." Jack nodded, memorizing the old fairy's words. Maybe this would be his path in the future. Or maybe it was a hint in his upcoming trial. What lies ahead for you is not illusory, nor is it artificial in any way. The difficulty of the challenge may seem entirely unfair or unjust, but it is proportional to the difficulty of the enhancement of your cultivation realm. Jack shrugged. "I'm used to things being hard. It's okay." The old fairy nodded. "There is another fairy by the name of Tinker. She is one of 3 existing earth immortal fairies in all of existence. Your trial is to rescue her from her prison, and help her find joy once more. As soon as you do those 2 things, your trial will be complete. There is a door behind you. Once you pass through it, you will enter his prison. Be warned that prison is specifically designed to contain fairies, so your fairy dust will not work there." Jack was stumped. Although he knew that trials had no fixed pattern, his trial seemed a little unusual. "Is there anything else you can tell me?" Jack asked. "No, I cannot. Go when you are ready." Jack looked at the old fairy, and then at his surroundings. He seemed to be inside a wooden cabin. "Thank you for your guidance, then," said Jack as he bowed to the fairy and stood up. "Will I see you once I complete the trial?" "Once you complete the trial?" That's a lot of confidence in your tone, young man. "I suppose that's a good thing. You can worry about that once you actually complete the trial." Jack nodded and then turned around. There was no point in waiting. He walked through the door without hesitation and found himself in hell. It was no exaggeration. He was literally in hell, and he knew it the moment he entered. Fortunately, though the stone corridor he was standing in did have thin channels of lava falls to serve as a source of light, the air itself was not on fire, nor was there any army of devils present to torture him. That didn't mean that everything was peachy. Just as the old fairy had stated, Jack could feel that he was unable to produce fairy dust. There was something about the stones that the corridor was made from that acted as an inhibitor. Fortunately, his wings still worked. Normal fairies would be unable to fly using solely their wings, since it was actually fairy dust that allowed them to fly, not their wings. That didn't work for Jack though, the most jacked fairy in existence. "Do you even lift, bro?" Jack said, and started flapping his frail wings. The sheer force packed within each flap of his wing pushed him into the air. "Yeah, I lift." Jack could not help but chuckle at his pun as he started to explore the massive corridor, unaware that there was an invisible hellion wraith behind him who was about to attempt possession of his body. His joke, however, had been so cringe, and so torturous, that the wraith literally went into the fetal possession and began to rock back and forth. It suddenly began to doubt which one of them was supposed to torture the other, because the fairy had done a better job in one line than the wraith could have done all day with actual possession. Chapter 1687, Make It Stop. Hell was not all that, really. For one, there weren't any windows in the labyrinth of stone corridors. It was also really stuffy. The air had no oxygen, but was filled with all kinds of poisonous or flammable gases, which, besides being bad for Jack's skin, didn't make it pleasant to breathe. The heating was also a problem. Everything was hot. Way to follow stereotypes, right? Jack's mortal body was not really equipped to deal with this much heat, and if Jack wasn't the strongest, most durable fairy to have ever existed in the mortal realm, he would have died just from dehydration. It was Jack's amazing cultivation technique, and the constant feedback from Lex, which made Jack's body much stronger than any fairy had any right to be. Crippled as he was without his fairy dust, the only thing he could rely on was his body, so it was a good thing it was so tough. If there was one area where hell seemed to be lacking in, it was in population. Jack hadn't met a single other living thing, not even a plant. When he was told this was a trial, he expected the difficulty to be more than just navigating through an endless maze. Not that the maze was easy. Jack had already spent a couple of days flying through it, at first carefully, but then later on at full speed. He made no progress simply because everything looked identical. All the halls, all the turns, all the decor, all the lava, it was all the same. If he didn't have impeccable memory, thanks to his other half being an immortal, he would probably just be roaming in circles forever. But he expected there to be countless guards, maybe a few other prisoners, any number of enemies around every corner. Yet he found no one. "You know, this place is not so bad for a hell," Jack said to himself, looking down the dull corridor. Since he was alone, Jack had taken to speaking his thoughts aloud in the last few days. "I mean, it's literally on fire. Talk about a hot property." Jack chuckled to himself. The lava lamps really add ambience. That one made him chuckle even harder as he looked at the nearest lava fall. He didn't stop for long, though, and kept flying. The moment he left, though, a couple of hellions fell to the ground, rolling on the floor from cringe. "Make it stop," one said hoarsely. "Please, for the love of damnation, make it stop." The puns. "He just keeps saying them," cried the other. "No, I can't take it anymore." "I quit," screamed the third, and threw himself in the lava, permanently ending his shift in this particular dungeon. Or any dungeon, for that matter. What Jack didn't know, most because the lack of his fairy dust even crippled his senses, was that he wasn't alone. He was surrounded by a race of hellions similar to wraiths. They were meant to torture and kill anyone who entered the halls, and were undefeatable to many. Jack, with no spiritual techniques available to him, could never defeat them using his physical body alone. However, his puns and bad jokes were more torturous and lethal to the hellions than actual torture. A while later, Jack finally found a room that was different from the usual ones he'd encountered. It had a large pool of lava separating two doors. Considering he could fly, it wasn't really an obstacle for him. "You call this hot?" Jack said as he flew over the pool. "I've done Pilates where I sweat more than this." This lava moat is lukewarm at best. As soon as he left, countless wraiths fell to the floor, crying. That wasn't even a pun. It was just bad. It was just bad. Jack felt like he heard something, but going back wouldn't do him any good, so he kept moving forward. He was finally making some progress when he stumbled onto a fork. Finally, the options were getting harder. This hallway smells like brimstone and bad decisions, Jack chuckled. You know I have to walk down the right path, because there's no way I'm walking down the wrong path. Maybe being alone for so long was getting to him, because he could have sworn he heard the corridor moan in agony when he said that last joke. But that wouldn't make sense. The corridor wasn't alive, he already checked. But as it turned out, the right path was the wrong one, because he ended up at a dead end. Looks like I took a wrong turn and now I'm in ing agony. Before he could even chuckle at his latest pun, the wall in front of him literally crumbled. The rocks just turned into rubble, breaking up and revealing a path ahead. A couple of times, Jack could have sworn he heard someone behind him, so he actually went back and checked. He found no one, and no ghosts or enemies jumped him in secret either, so he simply shrugged and carried on. A few hours later, he found a hall where the floor was lava, and there was a single cage hanging from a ceiling, a sleeping fairy within. It can't be this easy, right? Jack asked. Of course, no one answered. He checked the room for traps, because what kind of trial would it be if he could just rescue her so easily? That old fairy even warned him his trial would be incredibly hard. Oh, maybe he was referring to the toughness of the stone walls. Very clever. Hang on, Jack said to the cage that was hanging. At that exact moment, an earthquake struck, and a massive crack cut through the entire room, warning of an impending collapse. Ah, so there was a trap. What Jack didn't know was that his last joke had literally given a hellion a stroke, despite the absence of a brain, and the fallout from that caused the room to break. Jack flew up to Tinker and encountered his first real obstacle. He tried to rip open the cage, but the cage was solid. Getting it unhooked from the wall was easy, owing to the massive crack in the ceiling where the cage was attached, but he could not open the cage. Heck, he couldn't even find a door on the cage. Don't worry, I'll figure out a way to de-tinker with this cage, Jack said, wearing a smug smile. Another earthquake hit, this time much stronger. It almost felt like the whole labyrinth was breaking apart. Jack finally took the situation a little seriously, and began to fly out of the room as quickly as possible before the heat became too unbearable. But it was no use. All the labyrinth walls seemed to be cracked, allowing pools of lava to fall through from the cracks, filling up the halls. Talk about a heated situation, Jack muttered as he kept flying. There was an explosion somewhere in the distance, causing even more cracks to form. Hey, wake up, Jack yelled as he carried the cage. It would really help if Tinker could help him out of the situation, but the fairy was sound asleep. Or maybe she was in a coma, because no matter how Jack shook the cage, she refused to wake up. Talk about a deep sleeper, Jack muttered. Then, it happened. He no longer thought he heard someone. He definitely heard someone. Oh Lord, make it stop. Make it stop, a deep voice yelled somewhere in the distance, the vibrations of the voice causing the whole labyrinth to shake. Jack started to fly faster because the labyrinth was breaking faster, and more lava was pouring in. Though Jack had a strong body, he didn't want to try swimming in lava with it, so he desperately tried to find a way out. He was so focused, he didn't notice Tinker opening a single eye and looking at Jack oddly. Despite having gone through literal centuries of torture, she could not help but think that Jack's puns had a unique flavor to them that would be hard to forget amidst all the torture she had endured. Jack, meanwhile, flew through dozens of corridors until finally he found one that wasn't being filled with lava, and finally sat down to get some rest. He placed the cage beside him, and looked at the sleeping fairy. Since she wasn't waking up, he'd have to figure out his own way to get her free, and then find another way to bring her joy. In the meantime, since he still had no one to talk to, Jack looked at the sleeping fairy and couldn't help himself. "So, you come here often?" Then, hell blew up. Or, to be more specific, the volcano that the labyrinth was built within blew up. The volcano itself was being possessed by a hellion, and it could take the puns no more, so it quit. The moment it stopped possessing the volcano, there was nothing holding it back from erupting anymore, so it blew up. Chapter 1688, Who Ordered Takeout? Lex could survive a lot. His body had literally blown up and had then come back together. So being in the center of a volcanic eruption, for him, would be no problem. That was not the same for Jack. Now Jack, for a fairy, was strong. Heck, even for a mortal, he was strong. He was far superior to most nascent realm cultivators, even if he never used his fairy dust, or his most lethal weapon, his puns. But was he strong enough to survive being in the center of a volcanic eruption? It was questionable, since survival didn't necessarily mean remaining in top condition. A volcano in hell, though? Well, he would have to find out. The eruption wasn't instantaneous. There was a build-up, however brief. Jack was studying the cage Tinker was in when an earthquake struck. By now, there had been a few earthquakes, but none of them were this bad. As if that was not enough, a deep rumbling began all around them. That was, somehow, enough for Jack to understand that something bad was going to happen. Jack's fairy dust was blocked, and he had almost no options. There was only one thing he could think of doing, however insane it was. Wasting no time, he grabbed a loose brick, one that had fallen from a nearby crack, and hugged it as hard as possible, so that his entire body was against the surface of the brick. He then curled his wings around the bars of Tinker's cage. "Talk about a heated situation," Jack said. Tinker, who had also understood by now what was about to happen, could not help but flash her eyes open in abject shock about the fact that Jack could still crack such lame jokes in such a critical situation. There was no time for anything else though. The eruption happened, and what an eruption it was. This particular volcano had its eruption suppressed for countless years, so when it blew hard. The force of the blast hit Jack like a truck, if that truck had boosters and also was inside an exploding volcano. His entire body was instantly covered in hundreds if not thousands of hairline fractures simply from the shockwave of the blast. Then came the pressure of the brick that he was gripping, flattening his body like a roller. His wings were nearly ripped out of his back, but fortunately they held on as the cage flew alongside him. That was just from the initial impact, then came the heat. What could one say about that heat? Just that if anything that hot ever entered Earth's atmosphere, then the entire atmosphere would erupt into flames, turning it into a tiny replica of the sun. Jack was air-fried from the heat hitting him from the sides, grilled from the heat that the brick absorbed, and seared from the burning rods of the cage. All of that, too, merely happened in the first few seconds. Geez. I know they say you are what you eat, but I don't remember eating a shawarma, so why am I being grilled like one? Jack croaked. Of course, over the sound of the explosion, even he couldn't hear his own voice. Tinker, however, could. How the hell? Are you still cracking jokes at a time like this? Tinker roared, unable to hold back. She, too, was being cooked alive, though being an immortal helped her endure better than Jack. Jack was too overwhelmed by the various stimuli of his body breaking apart even as it cooked to understand what was happening. When he heard a voice in his head, he thought he was having a delusion, so he answered in his own mind. I was told fairies get their power from joy. There's not much else to do around here, so I might as well crack some jokes, he responded. Of course, the only reason Jack could even respond at all in his given situation was because Lex had so much mental power to spare. Jack had no idea where he was being flung by the eruption, nor did he have any ability to pay attention to such things. For a moment later he entered a new, equally difficult situation. Once his body was flung out of the vicinity of the labyrinth, he somewhat regained the ability to form fairy dust. However, the brick that was protecting his front was similarly inhibiting him. If he let go, he could use fairy dust, but then there would be nothing preventing his front from being exposed to lava. He had to choose between the two, and quickly. Ultimately, Jack decided to risk it, and let go of the brick. He turned around and grabbed the cage, freeing his wings to start flapping and producing healing fairy dust. But, surrounded by lava, captured by the explosive force carrying him upwards, Jack could not see nor focus on anything else, which is why he still couldn't see Tinker's situation. Out of the frying pan and into the oven, Jack said. Tinker, who had been tortured for centuries, imprisoned for longer, deprived of energy for an unknown period of time, heard Jack's last words and something inside her mind snapped. It just snapped. They were in hell, in literal hell, being cooked alive inside an infernal volcano, and this stupid fairy could still find the time to crack jokes. If that wasn't funny, then she didn't know what was. Or maybe she just had a mental breakdown from her impending death. Either way, she just started laughing, and once she started, she couldn't stop. Even Jack, despite his eardrums no longer working, could swear that he heard something, but he couldn't be sure. By this point, pain had replaced all his sensations, and his senses, so he had no idea of his surroundings or condition. That is why, as he continued to try and flap his already burned-off wings, trying to produce healing fairy dust, he had no idea that his trial had already ended. He had returned to the old fairy, who was looking at what looked like a deep-fried chicken finger, and wondering who ordered takeout. Chapter 1689, Coming Back with a Bang. Tinker was pressed against the base of her cage as it flew out with the raging lava, breaking through the many barriers in its path, until eventually it reached the open air of hell. The volcanic plume rose 3,000 miles in the air, or roughly 15.84 million rice cookers. So, it was easy to say that the eruption was clearly visible across the landscape, attracting a lot of attention. But Tinker didn't think of any of that as she laughed out manically in her cage. Her body was burning, albeit much slower than Jack's had been, but she didn't bother with that either. So much worse than the endless torture she had faced was the hopelessness that filled her very being as she thought about the fate of her race. But when she saw Jack, a kindle of hope had been reignited. He was heroic, or brave, or awe-inspiring, as one would expect from someone with the potential to rescue an entire race. Instead, he was deceptively intelligent, yet used that intelligence to fuel his idiotic tendencies. But maybe, that's what the fairies needed. After all, they were not brutes who needed the brawn to hold off a charge of enemy armies. They were fairies, the mischievous and joyful little fellows who treated the universe like their playground. Tinker got up and flapped her wings a bit, producing some fairy dust. But it was faint, as if nearly exhausted. Or maybe, it just needed a little push. Tinker looked at the pillar of lava that was still rising in the air, and the spreading devastation the eruption had caused. Talk about coming back with a bang, she said, her sweet, melodious voice carrying far and wide across hell. Then, from up in the sky, she saw hell itself shudder. Simultaneously, her wings began to produce fairy dust once more. A twinkle sparkled in her eyes. You must have faced incredible odds, the old fairy said as he waved his hand and began to heal Jack. Looking like a chicken finger didn't really suit him. You have no idea, said Jack, his voice hoarse. I faced my nemesis from another life. Let's just say we had a fiery reunion. Jack tried to chuckle, but ended up only coughing. That sounds difficult, the fairy responded seriously, missing the joke entirely. Or maybe he didn't acknowledge the joke on purpose. By now, you must have realized that the difficulty of your trial was set to be impossible. It was something someone of your level and ability would normally never be able to do. That is because the difficulty of the trial is directly linked to the difficulty of your ascension. For you to become an immortal, you must overcome an impossible barrier, at least for yourself. But since you have completed your trial, and you have even returned alive, then the hard part for you is over. Now, you need to merely recover to your peak strength, and the challenge realm will take care of the rest. Oh no, you leave the resting to me, Jack said. Somehow, he felt like there was someone somewhere in the universe begging him to stop. Of course, it was just his imagination. Neither of them spoke after that, for the old fairy did not deign to acknowledge Jack's joke, and Jack was literally suffering from burnout. but with the realm slowly healing him, it did not take long for Jack to recover, though he fell asleep as soon as the pain reduced to where he could ignore it. When he awoke, the pain was entirely gone, and he was as good as new. "When you are ready, the process will begin," the old fairy said. "Though, there is a critical question you must answer first before that." "What is it?" Jack asked, sitting up and stifling a yawn. "You can be raised to the earth immortal realm, but you are presented with two options for that. One is an ordinary ascension, where the realm will provide you with what you are lacking, and raise you up. There is nothing wrong with such an ascension. But on your person, you carry a certain item which can help your ascension greatly. It can make your foundation stronger, and do something that is otherwise impossible. It can continue to provide you with a path to higher levels. You must understand, if becoming an earth immortal was deemed impossible for you, then for you to rise from earth immortal to heaven immortal is doubly impossible. Yet the divine or in your possession, more specifically the purified, refined divine or in your possession, can make use of divine energy to make the impossible possible. It can act as a substitute for the things you need to reach higher levels. But to do that, almost all of the refined or will be used up." Jack was surprised at what he heard. This was too coincidental, wasn't it? He'd gotten just enough or to help him build a better foundation? Well, whether it was a coincidence or not, if it helped him, he would use it. Although the original plan was to improve the Jolly Rancher with that ore, he could always fix the ship later on. His own cultivation was the most important. "Use the ore," Jack said firmly. "Good. Just so you know, that will cause a bit of a ruckus. If I use the ore, your ascension will not go unnoticed, though the challenge realm will shield you from any and all detection, so no one will know your identity or where you are. They will, however, know that a fairy has reached the earth immortal realm." Jack shrugged. "That's fine. I'm used to it. Wasn't it normal to have a pretty noticeable phenomenon during one's breakthrough? It might not be for others, but it always had been for Lex, so it only made sense that the trend continued with Jack. Not to mention, he was literally trying to cause as much of a universal ruckus as possible. He had to get access to that nexus point, so the more upheaval there was, the better it was for him. Chapter 1690, When My Captain Breaks Through. "Sit down cross-legged and concentrate on my voice," said the old fairy as he stood up for the first time. "Hey old man, if you don't mind me asking, who are you? I don't think you're a real fairy, right?" Jack asked, even as he sat down as instructed. "I am the incarnation of the challenge realm. I appear before you as you expect from one who can guide you along your path. If your expectation changes, so does my appearance." "Ahan, that makes sense. And that old man Simons you mentioned earlier. That was a totally made-up thing, right? Why do I get the feeling that there's something to that?" The old fairy smiled at Jack knowingly. "Are you sure you want to know?" he asked. "On second thought, let's just start my ascendance," Jack said, closing his eyes and beginning his meditation. The old fairy just chuckled, and sat opposite to Jack in a similar pose before also closing his eyes. Jack felt a subtle, almost gentle pressure on his body, pressing down on his skin and transmitting a warm, comforting energy inside his body, initiating some kind of change. The ore that he had within his spatial tool was pulled out, and started to coat Jack's body, making him look like a metallic statue. Jack, of course, didn't feel the touch of the ore, nor did he feel the actual strength of the force encompassing him. Everyone else in the Artica realm certainly felt that force, however. The skies across the realm, in every level, suddenly turned dark, filled with countless stars in the far distance. An ancient, decrepit power radiated from that darkness, and an equally ancient, almost jovial power slumbered in those stars. Comparatively, the darkness was infinitely larger than the stars, but it could not blot out the stars entirely either. A very rare event occurred where the entire realm stopped whatever they were doing and looked up at the sky. Some were afraid, some curious, others intrigued, but none could look away from what was happening. That is because they were watching from a safe distance, not in the least threatened. Many Tao lords inquired about what was happening, but the Artica race did not reveal what was happening. Considering that they were not alarmed at all, it seemed they were well in the know. But soon, a surprising news was spread, at least among the Tao lords. The phenomenon was not specific to the Arctica realm. It was happening in countless realms across the universe. In fact, it was similar to an incident that had happened only a short while ago. A projection had appeared everywhere in the universe where humans existed. Now, though, the projection of the night sky was present everywhere that fairies existed. As soon as they made that connection, a realization dawned on the Tao lords. Those were not dormant stars in the night sky. That was fairy dust, and the night sky was. Compared to the relative peace alongside the night sky in the Arctica realm, most other realms were in chaos. That's because the night sky was not as calm and peaceful as in the Arctica realm. There, the observers felt the force of a great tug of war. The night sky had incomparable power, unquestionable authority, immeasurable influence, yet something was being taken from it. A raging roar, as if by some mindless behemoth of a beast, rocked the universe, yet it was futile to scream. The fairy dust continued to shimmer weakly, as it had always done. There was not much else it could do. But as the cry faded out from existence, a change occurred. The change was not just. In the night sky, fairies all across the universe suddenly felt like a lost path had appeared beneath their feet, though they did not know how to walk such a path. In the night sky, a patch of darkness had been ripped open, and a much larger celestial body, almost like a distant moon, appeared. It gave off an ethereal light, as if the light itself were concerned that someone might be harmed if it shone too brightly. But the harm was already done. The night sky had been ripped apart, and a curse that had plagued the fairy race for over an age had been weakened. For a time, nothing else happened, and even the night sky began to dim. It was as if the phenomenon was about to end. If only things were ever so simple. In a certain part of the universe, a pair of hateful eyes looked at the distant moon, and attacked. The owner of the eyes could not tolerate any blasphemy to its power at all. Yet there was one thing true for all beings in the universe, and it remained true even for the owner of those angry eyes: everyone has enemies. While there were some who were angry at what had happened, many also saw opportunity, and similarly made a move to block his attack. The fight did not take place within realms. Instead, it took place in the fabric of the universe, hidden from sight. But regardless of the winner or loser, the consequences of this fight would spread out and manifest across the universe. The challenge realm could not care less. It functioned according to the laws that had been defined in the universe already, so if anyone wanted to pick a fight with it, they could go complain to the universe. The divine ore, which up until now had done nothing, began to merge with Jack's body. The moon in the sky trembled, and started to grow, ripping more of the night sky. Divine energy filled the sky, uncaring about right or wrong, big or small. Divine was divine, and it needed to care not for the rules that limited the mundane. Rage, anger, chaos, all spread across the universe, and many armies immediately readied themselves to fight a war. In response, countless other armies also began taking up arms, ready to wage universal war at the drop of a hat. The intricacies of the situation went far beyond what anyone understood. The universe itself held its breath, its karma and destiny wound up tight. A palpable fear spread across all of reality. It could not, however, frighten those who had never known fear. Bob looked up at the sky, and simply snorted. Big deal. That's nothing. When my captain breaks through to the immortal realm, the whole universe will know it. His words resonated with the divine energy all around him, and spread out. Since he, too, was in the challenge realm, that resonance touched the divine or encompassing Jack as well. Through him, that divine energy reached the night sky seen across the universe. The distant stars, nay, that distant fairy dust began to reassemble itself, forming a simple sentence. Jack the Hellslayer sends his regards.